Hi, my name is Hanyang from Hanyang University in South Korea. I'm serving as a member of ICRP Committee 2 and also serving as the chair of ICRP Task Group 103, which is developing mesh type reference computation phantoms. Today, first I will introduce the ICRP mesh type reference computation phantoms, which were developed in our task group and published very recently as ICRP publication 145. Then I'll also introduce a phantom library which was developed from this mesh type reference phantoms. These are computational human phantoms used in ICRP for those coefficient calculations. The phantom in the left is called mathematical or stylus phantom, mostly used in the past. And the phantom in the right are voxel phantoms, which are used these days. In fact, these are the current ICRP reference computational phantoms for adult male and female. These phantoms were released in 2009 with ICRP publication 110. These phantoms were developed using the CT image data of real human bodies, and these phantoms more realistically describe the organs and tissues of the human bodies when compared to the stylized phantom. But these ICRP reference phantoms have some limitations. That is, in these phantoms, we can see still stepped surfaces, not fully closed. Thin or tiny structures cannot be represented. For example, the stem cell layers in the elementary and respiratory tract organs cannot be defined, so it was necessary for ICRP to use 12 additional stylus phantoms for those coefficient calculations. That is, ICRP didn't use only these two reference phantoms for those coefficient calculations. ICRP used 12 additional stylus phantoms for those coefficient calculations. There are more limitations. For example, the organs were adjusted to the reference organ meshes exclusive blood content, which is not correct. Some spongosa is not fully covered by cortical bone. Small cartilage, some cartilage is included in spongosa. Some other limitations. Also, these phantoms are not deformable. So these limitations were discussed in ICRP Committee 2 meeting in 2013, and in the meeting it was decided to convert the voxel type reference computation phantoms into mesh format to address these problems. Then a dedicated task group, that is task group 103, was established in ICRP in 2016, and the main objective of the task group is to develop mesh type ICRP reference computation phantoms which have all source and target tissues, including the details of the eyes and skin, and the thin target tissues of the elementary and respiratory tract organs. So here is the result. These are MRCPs, that is mesh type reference computation phantoms, which were developed by our task group by converting the voxel type reference computation phantoms into mesh format. And these developed phantoms are in tetrahedral mesh geometry. This is the male phantom, and this is the female phantom. And you can see the organs of the phantoms are very smooth and natural, and these phantoms can be also directly used in Monte Carlo code without voxelization, which is one of the strong points of these phantoms. This is because these phantoms are in tetrahedral mesh geometry, which can be directly used in Monte Carlo code such as MCMP, GENT4, and Fitch code. The simulation speed is also very fast, and quite often the simulation speed is even faster than the voxel phantoms. This slide shows some numerical data of MRCPs. Basically, the height, weight, and organ masses of the phantoms exactly match the ICRP 89 reference values. This slide shows a skin model of the MRCP, so you can see the 50 micron thick radiosensitive target region. This slide shows the respiratory tract organs. For this, we have defined all the thin source and target regions. For example, in this slide, you can see the very thin target region, which is only 10 micron thick, and the other layers are for source regions. This slide shows the airway model of the lungs for the male phantom. You can see very detailed structure of the airways. You can also see very thin layers for target and source regions. Here, here you can see the target region, that is stem cell layer, and the thickness is only 8 micron. And the other layers are now used to define the source regions. This slide shows Baron's eye model installed in the male MRCP. This slide shows the blood models, muscle models. This slide shows lymphatic node and skeletal models. This slide again shows the MRCPs developed by our task group. The phantoms were completed and the related report has been also published. This report was published as ICRP publication 145 last month. This report includes the detailed information on the phantoms, including the phantom data and even input files for Monte Carlo codes for MCMP, Gen4, and FITch code. So the easiest way to use the phantoms will be to use the input files and just modify the input file to change the source definition and then do the simulation. The phantoms are basically in tetrahedral mesh geometry, but we also provide the phantoms in polygon mesh geometry, so the users can easily change the shape of the phantoms to produce phantoms in different body size or different postures. Before I move on to the next topic, let me briefly talk about advances in phantom geometry. These days, we are mostly using phantoms in two geometry formats. One is voxel geometry, and the other is BREP geometry. That is boundary representation geometry. But these geometry formats have limitations. First, as I explained earlier, the voxel geometry is not deformable and suffers from stair-stepped surfaces, and it is difficult to model very thin or tiny tissue structures. On the other hand, the BREP geometry is deformable and smooth, but it cannot be directly used in Monte Carlo code. That is, the geometry should be voxelized before it is used in a Monte Carlo code, and therefore the BREP geometry is not fully free of the limitations of the voxel geometry. So several years ago, we proposed to use a totally different geometry format, that is a tetrahedral mesh geometry. Basically, we are proposing to fill the BREP geometry with tetrahedrons to produce a volume mesh. For example, like the sphere on this slide, a sphere or a polygon mesh, that is BREP geometry, can be filled with small tetrahedrons. Then the good news is that the resulting tetrahedral mesh geometry is still deformable and smooth, like the BREP geometry, and at the same time the geometry can be directly used in Monte Carlo code without voxelization, that is keeping the original quality or original fidelity of the mesh phantoms. And the computation speed is also very fast. That is why we developed the ICRP mesh type reference computational phantoms in tetrahedral mesh geometry. Also, it should be noted here that as we use the tetrahedral mesh geometry, we can even model the suborgan density distribution using the structure of tetrahedral mesh, that is tetrahedrons, which is possible because tetrahedral mesh is a volume mesh, not a surface mesh. It should be noted here that if you use BREP geometry, which is surface mesh, we cannot model suborgan density distribution, and the organ should be assumed to be made of a homogeneous medium, which is not always true and sometimes becomes a very critical limitation. This slide shows a phantom in tetrahedral mesh geometry, which was developed using a patient CT data in my research group. Here, the suborgan density distribution was directly mapped from the CT data. This is possible because the tetrahedral mesh is a volume mesh, not a surface mesh. In this phantom, the suborgan density distribution also continuously changes following the contraction and expansion of soft tissue during the breathing of the phantom. Here you can see the phantom is moving, and at the same time the particles are also being transported, which is for the Monte Carlo simulation. Here the green shows the photons, and yellow shows the electrons, and in the torus phantom, the blue shows the protons, and the yellow shows the electrons. The next topic is development of high-fidelity phantom library. Here I will explain how we developed a phantom library using the mesh type reference computational phantoms. For this, first we established a grid of body size, that is every 5 centimeters in height and every 5 kilograms in weight, to include most population. Then for each of the grid location, we derived the target values for 10 anthropometric parameters. Then first, for each gender, we constructed the grid center phantom by scaling and deforming the reference phantoms. Then from the skin of the grid center phantoms to produce a set of anchor phantoms with different body fat percentages. Then we use the anchor phantoms to produce phantoms with different body sizes. For example, if we want to produce a phantom at this location that is 185 centimeters in height and 125 kilograms in weight, then we first calculate the body fat percentage using the values of height and weight, and that is 36.6% in this case, and then select an anchor phantom which has a close body fat percentage. In this case, this one, and then use the anchor phantom as an initial starting phantom to produce a phantom with a target height and weight. So let's assume this is the anchor phantom selected. Then first, the anchor phantom was scaled in the Z direction for the torso, head, and legs. Then the trunk and legs were scaled in the XY direction to match the lean body mass of the phantom to the target value. Then the head was separately scaled, considering the target dimensions of the head. Then the phantom was adjusted to match target values with 10 anthropometric parameters and total weight. For this, we developed and used an intersection-free mesh deformation program which deforms the phantom, avoiding intersection. Then finally, the 50 micron thick radiosensitive target regions was defined in the scheme. So here is the result. This slide shows the phantoms with different body sizes produced with the program. And we produced phantoms as a library. For adult male, we produced 108 phantoms, and you can see very small and skinny phantoms, and also you can see very large phantoms. For adult female, we produced 104 phantoms. So here's the conclusions. The ICRP Task Group 103 has developed mesh-type reference computational phantoms for adult male and female, and the related report was published as ICRP Publication 145. These mesh-type reference computational phantoms were modified to produce a phantom library. These phantoms are in tetrahedral mesh format and therefore can be directly used in Monte Carlo code without voxelization, which maintains the original fidelity of the phantoms even in those calculations. And finally, the take-home message of this presentation is that the tetrahedral mesh geometry is very promising geometry for computational phantoms. Okay, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.